Breaking news, it seems that in the end, there might actually be hope for peace in the Gaza Strip. However, it's with a very bittersweet feeling, because it's Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu who are meeting to decide the future of a territory that clearly doesn't belong to them, and whose population has already suffered enough at the hands of both. It's not known to what extent this agreement will actually bring peace or not. Let's go point by point, listing the clauses of the agreement. We'll look at the reactions from both Israel and the Palestinian authorities, as well as some counterpoints that are already emerging on social media and are quite important when considering just how much social injustice we've reached at the moment, when the future of a population that is suffering is being decided as if they were not actually civilians, but rather a group of hundreds of thousands of aggressors. With that said, let's move directly to the agreement. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have met. I'll spare you the descriptions. And they've more or less reached this agreement, because of course, I'm presenting you with a summary of it. Point number 1, Gaza must be a terrorism-free zone. Point number 2, whether or not Gaza is free of terrorism, I imagine that will mostly have to be decided by the Israeli side. Second, rebuilding to improve Gazans' lives. This is also quite debatable and pretty subjective. Hopefully, it turns out just like that. 3, immediate end to the war, which actually never really was one because it's very important to be aware of that. If both sides agree, with Israel reiterating on one side and a ceasefire, but in exchange for another series of conditions, all hostages, alive or dead, will be released within 72 hours. 5, Israel will release Palestinian prisoners after the return of the hostages. We'd have to see how many, because they have infinitely more Palestinian prisoners than Israel has prisoners. 6, Hamas members will get amnesty if they surrender their weapons. Those who wish to may leave Gaza with a safe conduct pass. Allow me to doubt it, but let's let it go. 7, immediate entry of humanitarian aid and rehabilitation of infrastructure and hospitals. Here we'll have to see how fast they are and under what conditions they end up rebuilding it. 8, distribution of aid managed by the United Nations Red Cross and Argentina. This already shows that there wasn't enough humanitarian aid in the region, and proves right those of us who have been calling for the need to open several more humanitarian corridors. Because clearly, even Donald Trump and Netanyahu recognize the need for that humanitarian aid. 9, Gaza will be administered by a Palestinian technocratic committee under international supervision. This point definitely seems to me to be the most controversial, and later in this video we will see why, because there is also a kind of response to these points of the agreement. 10, an international economic plan to rebuild Gaza and attract investments. Here, we would also have to see what kind of reconstruction will take place, and whether that territory won't fall victim to the eternal Western desire to intervene. One more business. 11, creation of a special economic zone with trade advantages. For whom? For Trump and Netanyahu's friends, because I highly doubt that the people of Gaza could really benefit here. 12, no one will be forced to leave. Those who do can return. This seems to me like a slap in the face, honestly, because saying they weren't forced to leave and that they can return, considering that at least 40% of Gaza's territory is destroyed. Well, I'll spare you my comments. 13, Hamas and other factions will not govern. Gaza will be demilitarized under international control. Yes, the one who will govern is Donald Trump. But what exactly does that have to do with the people of Gaza? 15, creation of an international stabilization force supported by the United States, Egypt, and Jordan. It basically translates into the occupation of the territory of the Gaza Strip. Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza and will withdraw as security improves. They will be the ones to decide when there is or isn't security. And as for the claim that they won't occupy the Gaza Strip, considering that there will be American forces, among others, present in that territory, I find that quite debatable. 17. If Hamas rejects the plan, aid will be provided in areas free of terrorism, which once again, exactly who will determine that? 18. Establishment of an interreligious dialogue to promote coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis. This point seems directly impossible to me, considering that the civilian population of Palestine has been and continues to suffer today from at the hands of the State of Israel. How they can introduce and what kind of forces they can introduce to alleviate that? I don't know. I can't even imagine it. 19. Conditions to pave the way towards self-determination and a Palestinian state. This point is especially interesting, especially considering that, according to several sources, it is indeed in the agreement, but Benjamin Netanyahu left as soon as it was mentioned. Regarding the meeting in question, he speaks in terms of, on one hand, and here, so as not to spend too much time on his statements, you can see those English subtitles where he says that the meeting was held in Washington, that everything went wonderfully, and that indeed there are a series of conditions he has signed, but that under no circumstances have they signed the creation of a Palestinian state. The journalists specifically ask him about the issue, and he says no, that under no circumstances can the state of Palestine exist, because that would mean constant insecurity for Israel, more or less. So, basically, one of the key points of the agreement, at least on Israel's side, will never actually be fulfilled. Israel is going to oppose that for as long as it exists, but I imagine that, in media terms, they'll try to sell it as a successful agreement. That said, we'll see to what extent Hamas agrees or not. Point number 20. The United States will promote a political dialogue between Israel and Palestine towards peaceful coexistence. Another point that I personally doubt. That peaceful coexistence, for the next few decades, is absolutely impossible in my opinion. Having said that, let's now look at the counterpoints that really arise from this sort of conditions, if they are something like the consequences of them, on one hand, and also, let's say, the counterpart, right? What could end up being the response of the civilians in the Gaza Strip in idealistic terms? Of course, the only thing that is wanted, even on my part, is the end of this massacre. What I find extremely sad is that it has to be under these conditions, under the Western boot once again, and that the world has not been able to oppose what is clearly and that the Gaza Strip has been treated in a very different way compared to how things were done with the people of Israel when the Soviet Union, I remind you, liberated all those who were being victimized. And in fact, there was a time when the damage was repaired, which now, of course, will hardly be repaired in this case. When the aggressor is the aggressor. There was an aggressor. That said, the counterpoints that I think are very important to mention are the following here. In this document, they mainly distinguish 5. The first, denial of the right to self-determination. Imposing a transitional government without real and representative participation of the Palestinian population is equivalent to ignoring their fundamental right to decide about their political and social future. Part of several central government instruments. International. And we can already see exactly how much international law is worth with this whole issue of the Gaza Strip. Normalization of impunity, not dismantling Israeli apartheid, and, instead, allowing it to maintain its segregation regime by keeping territorial and/or political control, and not holding it accountable for international crimes such as ethnic cleansing or forced famine enshrines impunity. That is not peace. It is the consolidation of structural violence. International neutrality is false. Proposals like this are usually presented as realistic or pragmatic, but in practice, they legitimize the power imbalance. The international community would be validating that force, and occupation dictate the outcome, not law or justice. This third point, much to my regret, I think it's the closest to reality in terms of what will most likely end up happening, no matter how much it personally pains me and hurts me deep in my heart. 4. Criminalizing Palestinian resistance. Organized and armed resistance against occupation, apartheid, or ethnic cleansing is not a crime, but a right recognized by the United Nations and the principles of self-determination. By imposing a transitional government controlled by the aggressor and protecting their impunity, any form of opposition or resistance is de facto redefined as illegal or subversive. This turns the very right to defend oneself and to fight for freedom into a criminalized act by international actors who should be protecting justice. 5. Perpetuation of oppression. An imposed settlement that does not address the dignity, security, and self-determination of the Palestinian people does not create lasting peace, but rather new forms of resistance, violence, and suffering. Here I leave the floor open to your opinions. Of course, we still have to see what the reactions from Hamas will ultimately be. For now, it seems that the Palestinian Authority has said that they do agree with this agreement. However, Islamic Jihad has taken a firm stand against it. So we'll have to see what the Palestinian side decides, which, by the way, is also going through one of its most disorganized moments right now. Well, how could it not be? And even so, we also have to be very clear that what the so-called Palestinian authorities say will not always reflect the feelings and thoughts of the entire Palestinian people. Precisely because of that, because right now they are very disorganized. However, the ones people try to have a dialogue with, in some way, are those so-called authorities. The ones I personally care about the most in this case, without a doubt, are the civilians. And they will be, much to my regret, the ones who suffer the most from the consequences. Whether it is from continuing with because this is the main point. And, come on, the most important thing we should highlight is that if this agreement is not signed by Hamas, Israel has already received full approval, full support from the United States to continue with the work. That's how Netanyahu expressed it, or rather, to finish the work they have started in the Gaza Strip. That is, to complete the ethnic cleansing, which, by the way, is already extremely advanced. Donald Trump has said the same thing. Either you accept these conditions, or no one will be saved within that Palestinian state, and then the consequences will end up being much worse. We will see what the response will be, and therefore what the outcome will end up being. I mean, either way, I think the only ones who suffer are the civilians. And most likely their suffering, I repeat, much to my regret, has only just begun, because for the genocide to stop, we'll have to see when and under what conditions. Of course, that's what we hope for above all else, and then we'll see how everything else unfolds. But living under an occupation, especially one by those who consider you their enemy, is not exactly easy and could even end up being worse than. Basically, it's something like, now that your house no longer exists. It turns out that the land where it was located now belongs to me. Maybe I'll let you come back, but you'll end up living on borrowed time for the rest of your life. I don't think any of us would want an ending under these conditions or in these circumstances. So let's keep praying. For Palestine, hopefully there can be an ending that is a true peace.